Hey everyone, it's Barry Nugent here, aka Nuge. So this is a kind of, I suppose it's a special episode. I don't know if you'll think it's special once you've listened to it. But yeah, so I sat down with my fellow creative and good friend Corey Brotherson, who some of you will know because he was on. Corey is he's free. He does freelance fiction. He's a games and editorial writer. He's got over 20 years experience in that. I came to know Corey for his work on Magic of Myths comics, which he wrote, and his partnership with Yomi on the Clockwork Watch series of comics, and just the transmedia experience that Yomi's kind of created to go along with it. I think Corey, not only is he one of the nicest guys I've ever met, his work ethic just puts mine to shame. So I think over the years we'd always talked about different things, and I kind of wanted to, I don't know, kind of really sit down with someone and kind of just really talk about kind of the stuff that I've done over the years, really, and sort of my thoughts and stuff outside of a GS episode, if that makes sense. So anyway, we kind of rambled on for a lot longer than either of us thought we were going to be, so we've split this into 2 episodes. Here's part 1. I hope you enjoy it. So my reasoning, which I'll probably now leave in, my reasoning for asking you to do this is twofold. One is kind of because a lot of the things that I kind of want to talk about, or you may ask me about, sort of things I don't really talk about that much on GS or on other podcasts that I'm kind of on. So it'd be quite nice to have that kind of to talk about it from my own sort of creative endeavors, as it were. But also, and this sounds really morbid, but you know, I've just turned 50, so I've got a lot of that kind of looking back over like my life type thing, and certainly over my creative life and where I've done, you know, what I've done, how I see myself, all that sort of stuff. And this sounds really morbid, but you know, in the last sort of month or so, I've had a lot of people die on me, and it does make you sort of think about things. And I kind of wanted to do something that, if something happened to me, it sounds silly, but if something happened to me that Sue's pretty much said, you know what I mean, I probably won't listen. She doesn't listen to the podcast at all anymore. So I kind of wanted to do something that actually, if she did start listening, that she would have this to listen to. And it's just kind of me being me, talking about what kind of, you know, makes me tick, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I understand.
So
I mean, given that both you and Dave have been doing this for so long and been interviewing people, obviously, like, you both have been interviewed in terms of doing stuff for your respective crafts, but I would imagine that is very much amongst the minority of the times by comparison. And it is a good milestone to kind of to sit there and actually have someone ask you questions and actually go through the stuff that you've done and make a highlight of it, because it's very difficult for you to use Geek Syndicate as a beacon for that, because you probably feel like, well, you know, I can't cross the streams in that way.
Yeah, it's funnily enough, actually, over the years, quite a few people have said to me, why don't I use Geek Syndicate to promote my own stuff? And I have, you know, obviously, if you follow GS on Twitter, it is by and large me. You post on Twitter, and I will post sort of, be it artwork from upcoming comics, or, you know,
Yeah.
stuff that I'm writing. I'll put up like I'm writing today, or like when I finish the first draft of like my new book, I'll put that up there. But in terms of real hardcore pimping myself on it, I don't really go that far, and I certainly don't do many posts on the actual website for that. And it is very much, I think, crossing the streams is the right analogy. I like to keep the two things separate, and I don't want people to feel that because they listen to Geek Syndicate, they should be beholden to go and, like, I don't know, go buy my book or whatever. Geek Syndicate isn't an advertising tool for me. It's an advertising tool for every other person that we come across that we love their stuff. But I kind of feel that I don't want to use it. Certainly when we became more popular anyway, I sort of, I don't want to use it in that way. I would talk about stuff, that I'm working on. Dave and I will do that, but that's about as far as it goes. And some people think that it's weird, but that's the choice I kind of made with it, really.
Yeah, no, I understand that entirely. It's I think it's easy for people outside to want to kind of say, oh, why don't you do that? But it can get quite complicated after a period of time, and it can change people's perceptions of how they view both the work that you work on and Geek Syndicate as well.
Yeah.
And so I think you do it with the right level there. You could probably, I would imagine you'd be able to do even a little bit more than you do in terms of actually promoting some of your stuff. But it is such a fine line that once you cross it, it becomes very difficult to go back.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's totally understandable of that sense.
Certainly with the Unseen Shadows stuff, like the sort of creative team on a particular comic or whatever we're working, I'll promote those guys and the stuff that they're doing, even and sometimes I'll promote it more if the stuff they're doing is outside of Unseen Shadows, because I've worked with everyone that I've worked with within that project is a ridiculous talent that deserves much more attention than they're getting. So and I've been lucky enough to sort of get to work with those people like yourself, So for me to be able to kind of use GS as a platform to kind of promote them, it's happy days. It's a win-win as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. At the same time, it's like it'd be good for you to be able to get some of that as well.
yeah. Step into that spotlight just a little bit whilst you're here.
But yeah, so I think this will be a good crack. I think it'll be really interesting for a lot of people, myself included, actually. So
I hope so.
Kind of delve into the depths of Barry Nugent.
It's a scary place to be.
So thank you so much for this little role reversal, Barry. This should be quite interesting for a lot of people, I would imagine, and definitely yourself included in that. So really just to start things off, I mean, obviously I know who you are, and I imagine a lot of people who are familiar with Geek Syndicate and Unseen Shadows and Fallen Heroes, Forgotten Warriors, they all know who you are too. But there will be some people out there listening who may not be familiar with one of the many sides that you have, and you do have many strings to that bow. So for the benefit of those people, and also really just for the general audience, can you tell us who is Barry Nugent?
He's a lie. He's a sham. That's who he's a fantasy that doesn't exist. He's actually a marketing team for about 20 white dudes. I suppose who's Barry Nugent? I suppose in terms of everything really, Barry Nugent is a geek. I've always been a geek, and it's always been something that I wasn't always proud of. And we can get into the fact that yes, I'm, for want of a better word, I'm a podcaster. We've been running Geek Syndicate now for 15 or 16 years, I think. We started in 2006. What year are we in now? So that's 13 years.
Yeah.
So I've been podcasting for 13 years. I've been writing since I was 11, so pretty much we'll say 40 years. It's a nice round number. And obviously I'm I guess you'd say showrunner of Unseen Shadows, which is a sort of transmedia project, which the sort of focal point of that is my novels, Fallen Heroes and Forgotten Warriors, and the next one, hopefully, which will round the trilogy up. And and the sort of selling point of that is that all the sort of spin-offs from that, like the comics, the Choose Your Own Adventure when we get it finished, and the audio drama, they all are canon to the novels. So they're not nice little spin-offs. They matter. I guess, you know, I was doing the MCU before even the MCU was doing the MCU. That's what I'm saying. I'm sticking with it. Yeah.
Like seeing Kevin Feige and
yeah,
Sandra
you know, I heard that stuff about Spider-Man going back to Sony, and I'm just saying, do you know what, Sony? If you're struggling, just Barry at unseenshadows.com, just hook me up and we'll talk. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
But you know, all of that stuff aside, and I think kind of all of that stuff is easy to find. If you Google Barry Nugent, you'll find all of that stuff. But I think what I suppose what you won't find is the fact that now geekdom is something that is celebrated and fought over, and has actually become a multi-billion sort of dollar industry, and it certainly wasn't like that when I was a geek as a kid. And it was always something that it was something I kind of wanted to get away from.
Yeah.
Because I was the youngest, or I am the youngest. 3 brothers, well, 3.5 brothers. The half brother's a whole other story. And you know, it was, even though I rib them about it now, it was kind of difficult growing up in that household because they were all, you know, they're all into sports, very sporty guys, and they all supported whatever football team was on. They loved football, loved cricket, loved rugby, you know, and they would talk about it and all that sort of stuff. And I remember that I tried to fit in. Yeah. And I remember like one Saturday in particular, we sat down there watching football, and I was trying to understand what was going on. And you'd have that bit at the end on Saturdays where they show all the scores for the different teams. Yeah. I think it's called Final Results. I think the show's called. I don't know. Yeah. And they were talking, you know, about all the stats and stuff, and I just realised that I had no idea. I just had no idea what was going on, and no matter how much I tried, it always felt like I was distanced. It was like that running that long race type thing, and you could never quite catch up. Yeah. And it's one of the things with sort of through doing Geek Syndicate, I was able to talk about a lot of these sort of stories, like, you know, the fact that when I started secondary school, I got put in all the top teams for all the sports because I was a Nugent, and all my brothers went to that school, and everyone just assumed that I was going to be really good at sport, or in my brother Norman's case, really good at academia. And quite quickly they realized that wasn't the case. You know, literally after my first football match, my first cricket game, first rugby match, first athletics meet, I was out of all the teams because they just realised like, oh shit. And I think I even remember one teacher actually saying, you know, are you sure you're a Nugent? One of the sort of PE teachers or whatever, you know. And it was back then, you know, it was tough. It was. I found it really difficult because I was this sort of geeky kid, and I couldn't relate to that side of things, you know. But I loved my own company. I loved sitting and reading. You know, I always talk about one of the first comics I read was Tintin, but I used to read like my brother's Marvel sort of hand-me-down comics, which I loved. But I think the first comics that kind of became my comics were sort of Tintin and 2000 AD and Eagle, because they were the ones I was actually, well, 2000 AD and Eagle I was actually buying, whereas I was getting from the library. I remember every Saturday I'd go to the library, get the latest Tintin, come home, and then lie in front of like mum's sort of gas fire and then just blitz through the Tintin, you know. And it was almost a kind of secret thing to do, you know. And it wasn't really until I went to see Raiders of the Lost Ark that I realised I could kind of do something with all of this. Because I did have a ridiculous imagination. I was always in my own head with things, and I went through a whole like month where I pretended. No one knows this. I don't think even Dave knows this. Where I pretended. I didn't pretend. I kind of think I believed that if I behaved in a more dorky way with my glasses on compared to when my glasses were off, that it would be like I'd have my own secret identity.
Yeah.
And it took me about a month before I realized that shit's not going to happen. Just keep your glasses on. There's no point. It's not going to happen. So, but I went to see Raiders of the Lost Ark with my brother Norman, and that was what kind of changed. That and the conversation that I had with my mum soon after was what changed. It was what changed my life, I think. That was kind of where I really doubled down on being a geek, because my mum had kind of encouraged that side of me, And, she didn't give me no big speeches or nothing like that. Mum was old school. It was kind of like, if there's something you want to do, go and, and she suggested that I just write stuff down, So obviously I started writing. And then I went through a period where Dave and I wrote together. We don't talk about that period. I like to think of that as the dark times. Because he was lazy. I would write a couple of chapters, pass it to Dave. I would plan out the overall story, so I would then write a few chapters, pass to Dave with a kind of like, this is what you need to do, and then it could be anything like 6 months later he would finally get it back to me, and then I would carry on with it. And we actually did. I think we wrote 4 stories, 4 books. Probably you'd call them novellas now. I think you wouldn't call them novels. And even novellas, I use the term loosely. But and Dave kind of drifted away. But I just had that passion for writing, so I carried on with it. And that kind of passion to be a geek just filtered into every area of my life. Originally, I wanted to, and I think we talked about this before. Originally, I wanted to do comics. That's my first goal was, even before I was writing. So I was kind of a young writer, but I wanted to be a comic artist. Because I loved, my other passion was drawing. I loved drawing, and I used to sit and sort of draw Tintin and Asterix and all the rest of it. And so my whole plan was to leave school, go to art college, and become like a cartoon. I think I just did cartoonist. I didn't even say comics. It was just cartoonist. And weirdly, even though I failed abysmally at school, so kids, you have just got their A-level results. You should be lucky that you were doing A-level results, because I didn't even get that far. Don't worry, because when I say I failed, I mean I failed properly. It's probably one of my crowning achievements in life was the fact that I actually failed that badly. That is the one thing in my life I didn't do by halves. Do you know what I mean?
You went full out.
I went full out to fail, But weirdly, the only grade that I got that was even close to being semi-decent was art.
Okay.
My English, given the fact that I've written a couple of novels, I got. I was doing O-level English. I got unclassified.
What?
I didn't even know what unclassified meant when I got my results. Yeah,
that as well.
yeah. I saw you and I was like, "What's that?" And I had to look in the back. It's like unclassified. Okay, so effectively it means you got nothing. Effectively it means you got your name right and the date.
And here you are, an Amazon best-selling author. You should gotta go back to that school and just go and say, "Yeah, what's up now?"
Well, I mean, there were things as well. Probably not people that are now listening to the first time going like, yeah, checking these books out. Yeah, maybe not. Another people that have already bought a book, I'm like, suckers, but no, it's that I think what you realise at school is, teachers, and I didn't realise this till much later on in life, just the power that teachers have over you. When I say power they have over you, I mean the power for good or for ill, because I had a lot of teachers telling me what I couldn't do, like a lot. And my computer studies teacher told me he literally took me aside one day and told me not to bother because I wouldn't amount to anything in life. Wow. My English teacher would constantly, every report was Barry has an overactive imagination which he needs to learn to curb, which I felt seemed. And to be fair, I was a bit of a mouthy kid. I mean, I weren't Harry Potter. Do you know what I mean? I was a mouthy kid. So, but I always remember that I always used to say to her, but I thought that was the whole point of like English writing stories and stuff, was that I was supposed to have an imagination, and the bigger the imagination, the better, surely. And it was like, no, you need to get your head out your hands and whatever. So the fact that I ended up, writing novels, and the fact that my day job is IT, I don't know. I don't know what that's. Cleverer people will probably figure that one out. But also I had, I had my older brothers, and certainly my mum, and all of my family were fantastic, and are fantastic. But my sort of late oldest brother and my late mum were my two biggest sort of cheerleaders and influences, which is probably why I went into IT, because Dave worked in IT, and obviously mum was just mum. Mum was like Yoda, John Wick, and Samuel Jackson, all in a perm and a nurse's outfit that she never seemed to take off. Do you know what I mean? All rolled into one. So in many ways, I had no choice but to kind of like crack on with it, really, no matter what. Yeah. You get shit thrown at you. That's kind of life, really, and it's got to knock you down and all the rest of it, and you got to decide what you do with it at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
That was a hell of a long answer for who is Barry Nugent. So this could be a long podcast, people.
That's not a bad thing. And I just want to say that the fact that you had teachers say that stuff to you, and that you ended up where you are, is a wonderful, best possible FU to them. Because I really do. I don't understand how some teachers can be so obstinately negative towards their students in that way. And I know that, I mean, we're only about 10 years apart in terms of generation. Yeah. But when I grew up, I had similar teachers, not ones that specifically said that sort of stuff to me, but I knew of them.
Yeah.
So for them to say stuff like that is just, it's incredible to even think that, they could say things like that. And it's a brilliant achievement for you to be able to come away from that and have guiding figures that can guide you from that, and do what you ended up doing. I mean, this kind of really dovetails into a question that I did have coming later on, but this is actually quite good to bring up now. I mean, as one black man to another black man who has had a very similar kind of approach and background in terms of culture and in terms of kind of geekdom, how did you find that growing up in a UK creative scene, especially, and what sort of challenges did you face? Because I imagine that you were probably amongst a very small number of black people at the time that were into the things that you were into, because I know I certainly was.
Well, in terms of small niche, I mean, the niche was Dave. I mean, I had certainly there was we had our own little crew here. There was a group of us and stuff that were kind of into similar things. And I remember and certainly when I was a teenager, every Friday night we'd go around my mates. He was called Knuckles. His name actually was is Del Knuckle, but we called him Knuckles, or DJ. And we'd go around to his house, and we used to go to the local video shop and basically grab anything which had the crappiest title we could find. We'd grab that and basically get about 3 of those and a few beers and whatever, go and watch them. I watched every American Ninja film going. I watched every film with Chuck Norris going, and all of that sort of stuff. So they were geeky to a point, and that point was it was a very low bar for geekdom for those guys, whereas for Dave and I, we were kind of in it, and I think that was probably the glue that kind of held us together, because we both joke about the first time we met, and that I said I didn't like Dave when we first met, but Dave will 100% back me up. I'm gonna say that is 100% true. I did not like Dave, like at all. Did not like Dave. Kind of felt like he was sort of forced upon me. Looking back now, it's kind of like I don't know if it was some kind of test. the universe was giving me some sort of test. I don't know. If it was, I don't know what the hell my fucking reward is because I haven't got it yet. But but no, and I kind of think that certainly both being geeks and realizing that we were in to the same things certainly was a glue to sort of, that kind of kept us together in those sort of earlier turbulent times. And the fact that we went, and all of these sort of iconic moments that people talk about. So when you talk about geekdom, right, and this isn't me trying to be you, I was there when, but however there are certain moments in geekdom which are considered like landmarks. It's like in Dot 2 when they say there's certain moments in time that can't be changed, So it is things like the Star Wars trilogy, finding out, who Luke's dad is, the first time you see Wrath of Khan and what happens at the end of Wrath of Khan. See, I'm even trying to say things so I don't spoil it for people, seeing the Indiana Jones film in the cinema, all of these things, and all of those moments I shared with Dave. Dave and I went to see. I saw Star Wars at a different time. I think we saw it in the double bill actually, but we'd already both seen Star Wars. But we saw Empire Strikes Back together with the audience, and it was the first time, and no one knew how that film was going to play out. No one knew. And I even remember at the end of the film, they showed. We might have been at the beginning. No, it was at the end. They showed not footage, but just some shots of the set they were doing for Return of the Jedi, and I think it was I think what they were showing was Endor, but the film hadn't been made yet. So when people talk about Star Wars now, everything's there for you. Do you know what I'm saying? So, but we had to leave that cinema with that kind of bombshell that gets dropped to you at the end of Empire Strikes Back, and then we had to wait. It was something stupid like 2 years. None of that like next year nonsense you get now. It was like either 2 or 3 years. That was it. And there was no internet, so there wasn't constant. Oh look, here's a photo of, here's a little bit of footage of. Nothing.
No, that was it.
It's like you've had your film, kids. We'll see you in 3 years. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, but kind of going back to your question, I think it didn't really it became more apparent when we started doing Geek Syndicate. Because there seemed to be a queue of people lining up to tell you that you were black geeks and how much of a shock that was. Black UK geeks, how much shock that was, as if we hadn't realised it for ourselves. Do you know what I mean? And I could literally do a blog post or a book or whatever on the amount of repeated conversations I had with people where you would go up to someone to ask them for an interview or do something, blah blah blah. And I think because you were called Geek Syndicate, obviously the clue's in the title, and they would say, you're geeks, and would go, yeah, and they go, but you're black. And I honestly, if I had a pound for every person that said it to me since we started doing Geek Syndicate, I wouldn't need to be talking to you because you'd be talking to my aide. Because she'd be doing this interview because I'd be far too busy being like Tony Stark and building my whole fleet of Nuge suits. Do you know what I mean? So,
you should trademark that. Nuge
no, I should do that. But it was just, and it was just relentless. And we still get it now. And then, but you kind of. You learn to roll with it, you've walked the same road, you kind of roll with it because you realize as a black person working in that sort of world or whatever, that just comes as part of the course. And certainly in my own personal life, I got it all the time in the job that I did because I worked in IT and I was in London. And again, now it's very different. But when I worked in IT, most of the time, if not all, I was the only sort of, not even black person, the only person of color, there, and getting called names and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, But at least on the geekdom side, at least people weren't calling you names. It was a kind of innocence that you had to sort of educate people and sort of go certain things you shouldn't be saying and all the rest of it. But it was hard. But at the same time, because I was doing it with Dave, again, he's like my best mate, that I had someone to share that with and laugh with. We'd come home and sort of go, oh, for God's sake, But what I did find, and I still find it, that dealing with some of the media companies and stuff like that, and you would rock up to places and, be asked for ID when other people weren't being asked for ID. Walking into events that you've been invited to, and actually you're there, and then a member of security actually coming up to you whilst you're in the middle of a conversation. Someone else kind of saying, "Oh, can we just, have you signed in?" And go, "Well, A, yeah, we have, and B, I've just seen another 6 people literally just walk through without anyone stopping them." Why are we getting? And it was, and back then, certainly for the first however many years of GS, Dave had dreadlocks.
Yeah.
Which made it much more apparent. I'm not saying if we didn't have dreadlocks, they wouldn't have realised we weren't black guys. Do you know what I mean? But it was much more kind of in your face, straight from the bat.
Yeah. It kind of underlines things.
Yeah. And for some reason, you move up a pecking order. So, from my perspective, I was pecking order in my family. I always consider myself, not the lowest is the wrong way to put it, but I was the youngest, which probably in my house, everyone in my house had a quick mouth. Everyone had so you had to fight for your moment in the spotlight. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So I suppose that's where a lot of, and certainly within our group of friends as well at school, it was the same thing. So I probably think when a lot of people used to say when we first started doing GS, what they loved about GS was the banter between Dave and I, and the fact that actually we could insult each other to the cows come home, and you always knew that it was never a serious thing. Whereas there are other podcasts where people listen to where the podcast seemed quite or felt quite static and quite scripted. But that's just because of the environment that Dave and I were raised in and the sort of friends that we had in our families. That's kind of how it was. You fought for that little. If you got an insult in that landed and you got a laugh out of it, then you were on a roll. Do you know what I mean? If you could land, it was almost that spotlight thing of you get a joke that lands or an insult that lands on your best mate, you've got the spotlight, and it's kind of like how long can you hold that spotlight when there's 6 of you in the room? Do you know what I mean? And that has literally been my life.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I think there's quite a few people out there who probably feel a very similar way.
But what I would say to sort of round up that question, what I did find was the amount of people out there that were willing to support us and wanted to be a part of GS, and when we were doing listening a month, wanted to come on and things like that. And I really was worried about the sort of how people would, certainly when we started to get invited to things, and when Shane asked us to do the we did Bix way back in the day, 2006, and we were at the time we were the only podcast that did a panel. We were the first one that did a panel. It was a live panel. We actually recorded it as well. It had, Paul Cornell was on it, Dougie Braithwaite was on it, Dave Gibbons was on it.
Do you remember?
Yeah, Buckingham, and it was a fairly full room. It was like that kind of amphitheater type setup, wasn't it? And it was a fairly full room. And I remember beforehand, saying to Dave, I didn't want to do it. At the last minute, I was like, I can't do this. This isn't what I do. Because I've always been, Dave is an actor. Dave's always been the more gregarious out of the two of us. I'm gregarious in a controlled environment. Do you know what I mean? In a pub or in my own house or in someone else's house, I'm much better. But in front of a load of people I don't know, it was like, it was weird. And again, David sort of got me through it and just said, look, man, the minute we get out there and we start going, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it, and he was right. And we kind of went out and we sort of rode with it and stuff. And we didn't know, we were. And again, it's that thing of people can look back and look at where comic podcasting is now specifically, because then we were more sort of doing comics.
Yeah.
But again, once again, there was nothing like that. And we were, again, two black guys coming out. There wasn't a lot of people. There wasn't many people of color going to conventions and stuff. I mean, the argument is it still isn't, but certainly there wasn't back then. And you just didn't know how people were going to take you, And the thing was, people took you really well. Is what we found. Certainly, that was what I found anyway.
Yeah.
The geeks themselves, just welcomed you with open arms, and it surprised me. I wasn't expecting it. And I think when I went to Bristol, which was the first comic convention I'd ever been to, Dave kind of forced me to go to it. And again, I was terrified. I didn't know what to expect. It was about as far out of my comfort zone as possible. And this wasn't even doing a panel. It was just going. And everyone was so welcoming, And I was kind of like, why had I not done this before?
Yeah.
But again, but a lot of it was because I had my best mate with me backing me up. So worst case scenario, we would jump in Dave's car, get the fuck out of Dodge, and laugh about it on the way home as another thing that we've dodged, So as much as he does my head in from time to time, and I'm sure he'll say the same with me, many of the things that I've been lucky enough to do or accomplish, be it in GS or, my writing, whatever, I couldn't have really done without him just knocking about, really, and letting me have a go at him from time to time. Or just ring up the phone and run at him, and vice versa. Dave would tell you some of his stories and stuff, and some of the things. And there's certain times he'll ring up for a particular audition. And I remember it was one audition he rang me up for, and I hope to God he forgives me for saying this. I'm sure he will. But it was, he was struggling actor, blah, blah, and this was way back before either of us were sort of married or even with our spouses. And he rang me up. He said, he said, look, I've been offered this role. He said, but I'm struggling for cash and whatever. And I said, okay, well, if you've got to do it, man, you've got to do it. What's the role? And he was like, yes, it's the Lilt man. I went, you what? He went, it's the Lilt man. Now, for people who don't know who the Lilt man is, right, the Lilt man was a series of adverts back in the day, which I don't think they do anymore. I hope to God they don't anymore. And basically, he would rock up, and usually be some kind of reggae beat in the background, and it would be here comes the Lilt man, and he would deliver Lilt like it was milk bottles. Right, you remember this?
I remember this very, very fondly.
So, Dave had been offered the role of the Lilt man, and I said, Dave, I love you like a brother, man. But if you do this, right, I'm not saying, he said, you don't think I should do it? I said, no, I'm not saying that. But all I'm saying is, if you do this, you need to leave the country. All right? We'll still be mates and we can still talk over the phone. There was no internet then, do you know what I mean? We can still talk over the phone and stuff. That's all good. But you can't be in this country whilst the advert is showing, and then maybe got to give it a couple of years to let the shit die down, because our mates have got long memories. Do you know what I mean? And I know for a fact, if he had taken that role, even now to this day, well, I'm telling you the story, and he didn't even get the role. You know what I'm saying? He didn't take the role because he realised, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that would be the poison chalice, because I can hear the song going through my head right now, and he'll have people coming up to him and go, "It's the Lilt man, it's the Lilt man."
Nudging him, you know what I mean? He'd get more people like hassling him for like an autograph doing that than when we did the BBC shows. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think he dodged a bullet there in that respect. So what was it like actually, kind of like when you and Dave had the bright idea to actually form Geek Syndicate? When did that actually kind of like happen? And then between that time and when you actually launched in 2006?
Well, I mean, yeah, this will be a quick one, quick answer. So basically, because it was Dave. Geek Syndicate was Dave's idea. In that, we completely lost touch. I'd moved to Northampton, was living a good life because Dave was out of it. Um, but like, no, we'd lost touch, which is what happens. Friends, people move
Yeah.
on. People grow apart and whatever, and that's kind of what had happened. And what we were doing was we were kind of ringing each other maybe once a year, once or twice a
Yeah.
year, and we were having these kind of massive long catch-ups where we would just talk about TV we'd watched and films and comics. Because even when I got to Northampton, there was a few people at my uni that kind of were obviously into geek stuff and whatever, but not on that same wavelength that Dave and I. It was one guy who was actually my best man in my wedding, but not on the same level as Dave. We had that kind of shared history as well. So what happened was it was around the time that podcasts had just started. Despite what people will tell you now, like podcasts are suddenly it's the in thing now, and it's like where have podcasts come from? Podcasts have been around for a long time.
Yeah.
The difference is now famous people are doing it. Suddenly it's an explosion of podcasts, but podcasts people have been putting the work in for a long old time. And there was a comics podcast in the States, which was Comic Geek Speak, which Dave was listening to at the time, and he got in contact with me and said, have you heard of a podcast? And I said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And then he sort of explained the concept to me, and he said, oh, I think we should do one. And I was kind of like, why? Because again, the idea of putting myself out there was never my thing. Part of the reason I loved and still love writing is because it's for the most part, a solo endeavor, and I can do it wherever I want on my own time. And again, it feeds into that own space. I shared a room with two of my older. I never had my own room, until I came to uni. When I came to university, and I was in my 20s, that was the first time. That first night I slept, it was the first time I slept in a bed on my own, and I was like 24. So the concept of doing this podcast thing that he was on about, that people were going to listen to us talking nonsense, I didn't understand. And interestingly, neither did Sue. He just said it was a stupid idea, and I don't know what the hell you want to do that for. And I was kind of like, yeah, I'm kind of with you, But he said he's going to come up with some whiskey and pizza, so it's not a lose situation. Do you know what I mean? I'm still going to get drunk and I'm still going to eat food. Don't matter if no one listens to what we've got to say, which is kind of what happened. It was he rocked up. I've told the story many times over the years in GS. He came with 2 bottles of whiskey. He left with 2 empty bottles of whiskey, and we sat and we basically reviewed. I use the term loosely. We did some reviews, and we basically went through all, at the time, 6 Star Wars films and rated / reviewed / ripped the piss out of for, I don't know, 2-3 hours. It blurs because I don't remember most of that episode. And what I remembered about it, the feeling that I had about it, was how much fun it was.
Yeah.
And Dave and I have we did stop GS for a little while anyway, but kind of certainly this year again, we were talking about kind of, should we stop? We both have lives have changed dramatically, and highs, lows, all the rest of it. Can we still find a time to do this? But even when we've had those conversations, the stopping has never been about let's stop because it's not fun anymore and it's kind of a bit boring to talk to you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The fun has always been there. That's never really gone away. It's just everything else that's kind of around it that sometimes can kind of get in the way of it. But yeah. So that was kind of the origin, really. And again, it was that thing of we put it out there with no concept of anyone listening. And I don't even know when I realized when people actually were listening. Probably when we got the first email, where I just kind of thought it was a hoax that someone had done as a joke or something, or one of our mates had sent us an email. Do you know what I mean? Go, let's make them think people are listening. And then, and then I think it became more apparent when we started to do listening a month, and people were actually coming on. And taking part and actually, and having fun and all the rest of it. And I thought that was really cool. And that's when I started to get much more that kind of idea of community. And that's kind of what I wanted for Geek Syndicate. I think that's where that came out of, is that actually I wanted to kind of have a community of geeks, and to kind of, and that we would be, for the most part, positive about stuff. I mean, obviously there's going to be times you talk about things you don't like or whatever, but then we would try to be positive. And I think certainly the early episodes, we were roasting some stuff, man, and sometimes I miss those days of like Smallville days. But I think nowadays everyone's just, sometimes I think the idea of a successful podcast is you just spend an hour just ripping the piss out of stuff. And that, I think there's so many podcasts out there like that now that I'd rather not do that. It's quite, and for us it's easier because I can rip the piss out of Dave, or I can rip the piss out of something in a different way and yet still be positive about the thing that I'm reviewing. There's different ways to. I think Peter Rios, who used to be a part of Comic Geek Speak and now does his own podcast. He put out this episode a little while ago, which is like the top 5 things that does his head in for podcasters, and it's well worth a listen. But he's very much on that train of like, that it's really easy to be negative is really easy, and to be funny and negative is really easy. It's like I watched Phantom Menace the other day. Oh, that's shit. I could literally do 2 hours on the Phantom Menace, stand up on the Phantom Menace. But it's far harder. So I'm going to go in it in a different way. The podcasts that I like are the ones that are actually able to be really funny and at the same time be really positive about what they're talking about. And yet still be funny. And a lot of the funniness comes with the banter in between it, And one of the podcasts I used to love back in the day, and they used to rip the piss out of Dave and I mercilessly, were they were called Quiet Panologists at Work. And they did this whole episode, which was basically took the piss out of Dave and I, and they called it Geek Syndicate. And it came off the back that because of my London accent, but sometimes I'd say Geek Syndicate, and sometimes people would think I was saying Greek Syndicate. And they did this whole thing where they were basically like Greek guys doing Greek Syndicate, and it was, it was hilarious. It was, and it's and they were in it to kind of make money off marketing or to get sent loads of stuff to review or anything. If you ever want to listen to, because I don't even know if you can find those podcasts anymore because they've stopped doing it now. But if you ever want to find an example of a podcast that just does podcasting because it's fun, go and find those guys. If those podcasts still exist, because the slices of fried gold, I'm telling you, man. Because so many people now, when they start a podcast, it's all kind of like, they'll spend weeks. What do we call ourselves? How do we market ourselves? How can we get more listeners? How can we get the sound quality right? And all of these sorts of things. Whereas those guys were putting out some of the most inventive podcasts I'd ever heard, and still to this day, certainly in the comic podcasting arena, I still think those guys are like giants in terms of some of the creativity they did. So yes, that was Secret Origin.
Well, we're just going to kind of switch gears a little bit now, and we'll kind of say, obviously Unseen Shadows is the multi-headed transmedia hydra, essentially. It's It
Make it
covers
sound
so
like Mothra or
much.
something, man.
Yeah, that could be the next Godzilla movie. You know, it's just like Clean Shadows versus Godzilla. Kind of the whole battle going on. But I mean, this thing has spanned radio plays, comic books, novels, everything. But obviously, it started, or at least it seems to have started from the novel itself, Fallen Heroes. Is that actually the case, and where did the germ of that idea initially come from?
Yes, it did. I mean, it came out of the novel, and obviously you can go on Amazon and find out more about on Fallen Heroes. But Fallen Heroes it is overall a kind of pulp adventure novel. But my kind of idea, so the idea of Fallen Heroes originally came from my friends, and I don't know whether or not you know this story or not. I don't know if many people do. I don't
think so.
say it that much anymore. So what had happened was I'd written a novel before Fallen Heroes called Paladin, and
I had that one, yeah.
Yeah, my friends have read it, and they're always on at me saying, like, you know, they wanted to be characters in one of my books, because I used to do that when I was at school. The stories I used to write used to involve some of those guys, and so I said to shut them up, basically. You go away and come up with the characters, and I'll do a story around it. Thinking, yeah, that'll keep me sweet for 10 years. I won't have to worry about it. And the fuckers all came back with characters. So, you know, so let me see now. So the Reverend, Ben Ashodi, Letha Washington, Joshua Gray, Stephanie Conisby. I didn't come up with those names.
Wow. Okay.
Clang. These are like my mates that come up with them with backstories. Now, where I come in was that some of the backstories were so ludicrous that I'm kind of like, I can't. I've got nothing to work with. Do you know? You've given me nothing to work with, other than say Ben. Which, if you listen to Meichi Hail Up, because it was Meichi that did Ben and Steph. And Meichi had come up with, although he had Steph in hot pants, and the minute I saw it, I was like, no. and Ben originally he was always I'm sure he was always Ben Ashodi. He was always the hand, but he also was like a kind of DJ who ran his own nightclub and all this sort of stuff. And I don't know if you ever read that version, but I did actually write a whole introduction chapter where Ben had his alter ego as a DJ.
Okay.
And it was like a cover for his work as the hand. And like Steph was kind of like one of his sort of like bouncers / kind of like dancing girls or whatever. And I wrote, and that was like, I think that might have been the first or second draft. And then I chopped it because I kind of wanted to go a bit more down a different serious route. But I think I've still got that somewhere. And I really liked the intro because he came in like he was James Brown. And there's a whole bit where he kind of and he's this worldwide celebrity like DJ. And there's a whole bit, he's almost like Yomi, do you know what I mean? And there's a bit where he jumps off a limousine, and he says something like, we were ready to party with her. And then some guy appears from nowhere and puts a cloak over him. But given the tone that I was going for with Fallen Heroes, I kind of felt like that was a little bit jarring. But the days I missed that side of Ben. But yeah, so they'd come up with all these characters. Again, someone had come up with the Reverend, but again, he was much more over the top than how he became. So I took characters, worked on them, and the more I worked on them, but to be Napoleon and some of the other characters of mine, Napoleon was always mine. Napoleon was a character I came up with when I was, I think, 15. I actually drew him. I drew him at 15. I've still got that picture. The main reason I've kept that picture because it can be carbon dated. The reason I'm saying that, it seems a bit extreme, but obviously what people will notice when you look at the cover of Fallen Heroes, that he bears a striking resemblance to Samuel Jackson as Nick Fury.
Yes.
Which is something that I get remarked on mainly at conventions, but not when I was doing my book signings. No one seemed to bother, because I always used to say, more than one black guy can have a, missing eye.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
but I always say, no, I came up with that character when I was 15 years old, and he always had the eye patch. He did have a flat top then, but that was the 80s. And the minute I started writing him in Fallen Heroes, and I did it, Napoleon Stone, black guy, I thought, no, that needs to go. Do you know what I mean? No, that he needs to be bald. That needs to go. Only Blade can pull off that kind of like hairstyle. You know what I mean? So yeah. So the more I worked on the characters, the more I realized that what I had was archetypes, and in that I had the thief, I had the I had the vigilante, I had the adventurer, I had the detective, who was Catherine. And what I suddenly realized what I wanted to do was this kind of, what if you had this, I guess, a kind of Avengers-like setup? Because really, the first half of Fallen Heroes is like all the individual Avengers movies.
Yeah.
And then the second half of Fallen Heroes, because they're all kind of together, is like the Avengers movie, because then they're all together.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to do was create these characters who were these sort of mythic figures within the world, that had kind of almost become a bit jaded and a bit over the hill to a certain extent. And then this adventure, free novel adventure, would kind of reinvigorate them, I guess, for want of a better word. And I was so used to reading books back then where it was a hero's journey. So it was taking someone who was quite young and then taking them through the hero's journey. So what I kind of wanted to do was, what if you had characters that had already been through their own hero's journey, and then sort of bring them all together. And yes, you've got a character in there who's Jason Shen, who effectively is kind of doing that hero's journey thing, but he's only one of sort of 5 or 6 main characters. So obviously I wrote Fallen Heroes. I then self-published Fallen Heroes at a time where apparently you weren't supposed to self-publish stuff. Someone could have told me that. Did quite well, more better than I ever expected it to do. I was just proud and happy that I'd finished it, to be honest. And I loved it, and I think it's something that some writers do say often, other writers don't. But regardless of what success I have with any of my stories, like, I flipping love those stories. Do you know what I mean? I get a buzz from reading certain chapters because I really enjoyed writing those chapters. So I should be able to stand and say, I shouldn't sort of go, well, it's the best I could have done at the time. Yeah, it was the best I could do at the time, but also I flipping enjoyed that experience in those books.
That's the way it should be.
So obviously I put it out there and stuff, and then I got approached by a comic company which was around at the time, which I think was Insomnia Publications, I think that's what they were called.
Yes.
And by that time I'd kind of become friends with Cy Ditton and Nick Wilkinson, and they were kind of involved with Insomnia as well. And they wanted to do, the person I was running it wanted to do as a graphic novel adaptation. And Nick had kind of put together this, creative team. And for me, it was a dream come true, because it was kind of like, what? You want to do a comic out of my book? What? Yeah, hell yeah. So, but then what happened was that company went bust, and varying other things with that company, which we won't go into.
Yes,
It wasn't a great time for a lot of creative people back then. But what happened was, throughout it all, the creative team for Fallen Heroes kind of stayed together. And I was really passionate about getting it done, getting it out there, even if we only did one issue, So I went and I approached a couple of companies. I think 2000 AD was one. I can't remember who else I approached, about getting some sponsorship. They would put ads in the comic and stuff like that, and that kind of covered the first print run. And I took it to I think it would be launched at the Cardiff Comic Con or Cardiff International Comic Expo, which was something he was doing. And I remember, still one of the high points really. We sold out within half an hour. I actually had to go and take copies off one of the creative team because I wanted to sell more copies. It's like, those 5 copies you got. Can you, get a couple? And he's like, yeah, cool. So yeah, so we did. Sadly, we were only able to do 2 issues, and then obviously the creative team had other projects they needed to move on to, which was fair enough. For me, it was a dream anyway. But what happened was I had got into lots of long conversations with Si, who'd read the book, and to my eternal joy, I'd loved the book, as had Nick, and so we'd often talk. And he kept saying, how much he loved the Reverend as a character, who's this sort of vigilante ex-priest. And in the end, it was Nick. She sort of said, well, why don't you pitch Barry a Reverend story? And I was kind of like, yeah, okay. And we had no team or nothing. And he sort of pitched me this story, which was kind of like it was his kind of origin story, which isn't in the novel. But what I'd done at the time when we talked about it, I'd had a deleted scene from the book that I'd taken out, which was kind of part of the Reverend's backstory. It's a bit where he sort of wakes up after he's been in a coma and stuff. I mean, his background. Anyway. And I'd given this to Si, and kind of from that, he'd sort of used it to craft this pitch for a story, and I loved it. He sent me the pitch, talked to me through it. I loved it. And we were lucky because the creative team from Fallen Heroes was still knocking around, and they loved it as well. And at the time, like the sort of colorist and the artist really wanted to work with Si. And then all of a sudden, we were working on a comic called Wrath of God. And I was kind of like, I don't know how this is. A lot of these stories end up with me going, I don't know how this has happened. What also came out of it was that obviously Si and Nick moved in, the indie comic scene, and knew a lot of people, and then people got wind of what Si was working on, or literally were asking Si, what you're working on, and he was telling them about it. So I was getting emails from other writers, and sort of saying, could we get in on this sort of thing? And my response, which has always been, as you know, as someone who has written 2 stories, was, well, Si's read the book, so if you're interested, then go away and read the book, and if you're still interested, then get back in touch. And again, like whatever you want to call it, the writers went away. They read the book, came back, said how much they loved it, and they still wanted to be a part of it. So I what can we do type thing. And I said, well, you choose a character and you pitch me a story, and we'll go from there. And I think, and I certainly remember most of the time, certainly in the early days when I would say that to them, they were quite taken back because this was my work, and it was kind of like, I was, just pick a character. Just pitch me a story, it's cool. And I'm trying to remember in the first one, so we had Wrath of God, Band of Butchers, Operation Solomon, and Fragments of Fate.
Yes.
So so we had Dan Thompson, obviously Si, Pete Rogers, and Richmond Clements, who would arise. And there was a lot of back and forth because obviously they'd picked characters, but what I was then kept banging on about was that I wanted everything to be canon. I didn't want the spin-offs to not matter. I wanted them to have weight. So it was then about not just them pitching stories, but it was pitching stories that would fit within certainly the first novel, which is why a lot of them, and I think I think probably the really interesting one was I think the really interesting one was actually the Operation Solomon one, which was Steph, because that literally came out of like a sentence in the book where the book basically says that she was in the Navy and then she got kicked out of the Navy and then she met up with Ben and basically is now a thief slash bodyguard pilot to Ben. And that was like one sentence, and we got a 24-page comic out of it, which then, for people who have read sort of Forgotten Warriors, was basically the spine that ran through the entire Forgotten Warriors story.
Yeah.
You know, if you've read Operation Solomon, and you read Forgotten Warriors, a lot of that dovetails straight into that. A lot of the, you know, some of the twists and turns from that comic get picked up in that book, you know. And I think certainly in the stuff that I was trying to do in terms of building a world or universe, whatever you want to call it, I think really came to fruition for me when I was writing Forgotten Warriors, because people were still creating comics, and obviously we did the audio drama, and the audio drama was really interesting because the audio drama at the time was the first property that we did which was set after Fallen Heroes. It's actually set, I think it's set 6 months after Fallen Heroes, and it's focusing on one of the characters who is Vincent Marconi. But out of that, there was another character in that audio drama that he was partnering up with, which was Victoria Sullivan, who I loved so much that we managed. Not only did you do a little origin 4-pager, was it 6 page? Yeah. 6 page, I can't remember. We also did. She then appeared in a full-length graphic novel, partnering up with Steph.
Yeah.
And originally she was in Forgotten Warriors, you know, but for varying reasons, I sort of cut her out because that bit of the story wasn't working as well. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and I was constantly sending you guys updates and little clips from the book and whatever, because that was what I was trying to get across, was the idea that everything that the teams were working on mattered and was influencing me as I was working on the sort of certainly the next 2 books.
Yeah, I think that's always something which is, for me, is quite an astounding kind of thing. It's such a difficult prospect to manage so many different characters in a book in itself, in just a single story. But when you have to manage multiple characters across multiple mediums that are dealt with different creators, I would imagine that in itself is a pretty Herculean task to try and keep track of everything and make sure everything lines up and tallies.
Yeah, it's been quite challenging, especially given I've not got a particular head for business and I haven't got a particular head for organisation. So I'm not quite sure how I ended up with all the people that not only working on Unseen Shadow, but all the people that I've worked with over the years on Geek Syndicate and all the different podcasts that came through on the Geek Syndicate feed and are still on the GS feed. I'm not quite sure how that happened because I'm the world's worst organised. I'm not good at organising things. You know, if you think I am, I'm really not. I'm not like Nick Fury. I could just rock up at the back and I want to talk to you about an initiative. I'm not that. I'm the person that rocks up after Tony Stark's walked out and I'm like, oh shit, I was going to ask him something. Do you know? Oh, my tie's gone now. Do you know what I mean? There would have been no Avengers if I'd been involved. None. So yeah, so I think part of it is, I don't know, luck, willpower, having a kick-ass wife, and having fantastic people to work with who are organised in their own way as well, and who are passionate. So much I've been able to kind of dodge so many bullets and take so many bullets because I'm passionate about what I do. Yeah. And I think whenever I hit rock bottom, which has been quite as you know, has been quite a few times, the thing that actually does kind of to get all rocky, but the thing that has kind of got me up has been my passion. And you know, no matter how many times I say to myself, "That's it," you know, I can't write. I was doing that this year, you know, we had long conversations about it. You know, I can't write. I don't know why I'm doing it. I'm a fraud. Why am I even bothering? You know, the thing that brings me back to it is my passion for writing a story. And when it brings me back, it doesn't bring me back with trumpets with the view of me going, I am that good. I'm going to show them. No, it literally, it's a very quiet, brings me back to kind of, but I like writing stories.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And everything else has to kind of come after that. But that one thing which makes me go, oh, I'm lying in bed, it's 5 to 4, why are you even bothering? Because I hear that voice every day. Why are you even bothering? It's kind of because I like writing stories. That's the answer I get back, because I kind of like writing stories, and it doesn't matter if I don't publish it or no one reads it. I like writing stories.
Yeah.
I laugh along with the characters when when I've written a bit of fun dialogue, or I gasp when I'm writing some trap they've got to get out of. Oh, you say you get out of that, and then I spend 6 months going, oh yeah, shit, how do they get out of that? But that's, and I think there's a commonality to kind of creative people, and I think that's the glue that binds us together is the fact that, and I think maybe people call it different things and they refer to it in different things, but it is really just a passion for what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that probably not enough people talk about as well.
Yeah.
That sense of imposter syndrome is something that people are mentioning more when they talk about the creative process, but I think it is something that it's very easy for outsiders to look at this shining, glittering example of creative work and go, oh, wow, it must have taken a while to get through that, but not realizing the stages and the mental trauma that you have to progress through to get to that stage. I mean, when you finished Fallen Heroes, you came off the back of an Amazon bestseller. You had the Rivers of London author, Ben Aranovich, basically hype you up. He came out of nowhere. He read the book.
It did come out of nowhere, actually.
It was just incredible. I specifically remember you saying, this dude has written this amazing review about the book. And my wife at the time, my wife still is my wife, mentioned she was the one that read it first. And I was just like, what, really? That's incredible. That's fantastic. And then you having to go through that process of not only the pressure of having all those big, lofty expectations and people like Ben Aranovich praising your book, and then going into the always going to be tricky second book with all of those little kind of demons nipping at you. I mean, the second book, Forgotten Warriors, is exceptionally dark. Not to put too fine a point on it, it is strikes back to Fallen Heroes Star Wars. Was that kind of an intentional thing where you knew you was going to go to a fairly dark place in itself, but with all these different elements of pressure crushing around you, did you end up using those into creating the second book and that made it as dark as it was?
And on that bombshell question, we're going to end it there for this episode, but I will be picking up the answer to that question in part 2 of the interview. If you've enjoyed listening to me rambling on for an hour, why wouldn't you? You can get in contact with me or Dave or anyone on the Geek Syndicate network. You can get in contact with us at the Geeks at geeksyndicate.co.uk. We're on Instagram, Geek Syndicate. We're on YouTube. We're on Twitter, Geek Syndicate. We're all over the place. And I'll be back in the next episode. And obviously, Dave and I will eventually be back with more GS. So take care, guys, and happy geeking. This is Barry Nugent, aka the Nuge. I'm out.